On the surface, this is all good. It's the easy, convenient mobile payment system of the future. But there's also a dark side. The Chinese government can peer into the two dominant payment systems, Alipay and WeChat, as it sees fit. It's already started tracking behavior as part of a plan to rank citizens and measure how good and obedient they are. The tech revolution may have brought prosperity to Shenzhen, but it's also brought more and more insidious intrusions into people's lives. To dig deeper into life under the Chinese deep state, I've assembled a team of extraordinary foreigners who work at tech startups in Shenzhen.
The cops come and stop you.
Well, you jaywalked and you had facial recognition.
The craziest thing, I actually got this. Yeah, so I was jaywalking in Nanshan, and all of a sudden I got a fine to my WeChat.
Was it instant?
It was about 20 seconds after, I guess. And I had money in my balance, it just went straight out. And this is just the most incredible thing. It just came straight out.
Didn't even authorize
and
it.
That was incredible.
That's crazy.
It's true. Try to jaywalk in certain parts of Shenzhen, and the government's facial recognition will spot you. There's even a board of shame showing the faces of recent offenders.
I'm surprised and very, very worried that they have your face in the facial recognition.
They have everyone's, though. I mean, when you get across the border, they take that picture. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's all in the system. They know where you are.
That's scary.
Now, Google is dramatically expanding its artificial intelligence research operations in China, which is bolstering an effort that could eventually imperil the security of this country. Google describes itself as a multinational company, really a kind of corporation of the world, but it was incubated here. And everything about Google fundamentally is American. It wouldn't have been possible to start Google in China. And yet Google doesn't seem to feel any obligation whatsoever to the U.S. government or to the American people. So how does that work exactly?
Look, this is capitalism. I mean, these companies are responsible.
Actually.
Well, these companies are responsible to their shareholders.
So American taxpayers subsidize the education of the people who founded Google and who work there, and we create the regulatory and legal framework possible for it to start. Again, no other company like this has started in Europe, for example, certainly not in Asia. So we make it possible, and then they turn around and undermine the national security of the country. I know that people describe that as market capitalism, but that seems immoral to me.
And I think that the published reports of Chinese weakness are nowhere near what we're seeing in China beige book data. We are seeing much more substantial weakness across the Chinese economy. Now, they have a little bit of a blind area here because January and February is Lunar New Year, and so you don't get good data out of those 2 months. But the Chinese economy is weaker. The Chinese are more pushed to have a deal. They're in a bad state. But at the same time, if President Trump doesn't want to hold them to the fire the whole year and cause pain, then he's sort of rushing into this too. We have more leverage, but we're still headed to a quick deal anyways.
The defaults in China is showing us how leveraged they are. And I think that's one of the things that's holding back China from really doing the stimulus they used to do in the past. Right now, if we had a traditional slowdown in China, China would have unquestionably pumped up credit and shot up the housing market and try to revive domestic demand that way. Right now, you see how reluctant they are to do so because they've already gone on a campaign of reassuring the world we're having policies in place that put a handle and a lid on the rise in leverage. That is the big constraint the Chinese are facing now, and that's why I think they're so desperately looking to make a deal with Trump. A lot of the defaults, even in the private sector, are linked to state-owned enterprises one way or another very indirectly because a lot of the owners of the private enterprises are linked in some familial or other political way to the heads of the states, of municipal and local governments. And so we see that they're very reluctant to let the cascading effect that would normally take place in a Western economy occur in China.
Well, look, as you know, China purports to be the second largest economy in the world with 15% share of global GDP. But if you look at cross-border currency settlement, according to SWIFT, less than 1% of the world settles in Chinese currency. So Chinese is really just a paper tiger, or China's just a paper tiger. And I think that they have done so much work in order to prop the yuan up or the RMB up that the funny thing is that we consider calling them a currency manipulator on the weak side. In reality, what they've been doing is the tipping point will be when you look at China from a macro perspective. They've got a current account deficit and they're running a massive fiscal deficit. So their consolidated fiscal deficit is a little bit north of 10% of GDP, including local government finance vehicles. Think about the US. We're now a little bit more than 4% of GDP and all the alarm bells are going off when China's at 10% of GDP. So China's starting to look like a traditional EM problem, meaning they're borrowing, they've borrowed $1 trillion in the global capital markets, Chinese corporates have. Chinese banking system is more levered than any banking system's ever been in the world, and they're now running a current account deficit. So now they're a twin deficit country with reserves that are dwindling. And so when you ask when is the time, I guess the answer is no one knows, but it sure is worsening as we speak. China works in two worlds. One, they work in their domestic world where it's RMB denominated. And in their domestic world, they control the price level, they control the police, the printing press, and the narrative. China can really much control their domestic market almost ad infinitum. But where you start to see defaults are when they borrow in dollars because they can't manufacture dollars. And so you're going to start to see them defaulting on dollar-denominated debts over time. And so when you look at the number of corporate defaults, and especially corporate defaults in dollars, that's where they're going to have a problem. If it's an RMB, they can sweep it under the rug and print RMB. You look at how many RMB they've printed since their ascension to the WTO, or more importantly, since 2009. You realize they've printed $30 trillion worth of RMB if you look at the Chinese money supply. They've printed like it's the national pastime. They've embarrassed the US, Japan, and Europe on the printing side. And so I think that's all going to come home to roost soon.
China has a unique state-driven model of capitalism that clueless economists have hailed as the new model for economic success. But I say China's model and economy will fail drastically, proving once and for all that government-planned economies do not work as well as free market capitalism balanced by democracy. China has massively overbuilt everything: industrial capacity, housing, offices, malls, infrastructure, you name it. It's overbuilt twice as much and for twice as long as any other government-driven emerging economy ever has. And China has made that situation look puny by comparison. There is no way this can end anyway, other than very, very badly. The question is, when will an economic collapse come? The answer is, sadly, sooner than you'd like. Here are the 10 signs the end is near. Sign number 1. Recently, a large Chinese property developer decided for the first time to discount condos by 60% when sales stalled. The thing is, this is a shocking step to take in China. It's just not done. The affluent Chinese line up to buy overbuilt, empty condos at insanely overpriced levels. They don't rent them out because there is no rental culture in the country. 90% of homes are owned. They simply buy the property and let it stand empty. So when a developer cuts prices and thus devalues their investment, they get bitterly angry. There are people who bought multiple homes who are now trying to sell one to pay off the mortgage on another, said Ran Yunji, a property agent. One of his clients bought an apartment last year for $230,000. To find a buyer now, the client would have to drop the price by 60%. Meanwhile, in a truly concerning demonstration of what will happen when the bubble finally bursts, last November we reported that angry homeowners who paid full price for units at the Husin Hao Mansion residential project in Shangrao attacked the Country Garden sales office in eastern Jiangxi province after finding out it had offered discounts to new buyers up to 30%. But this discounting trend is likely to spread rapidly now, as more developers are forced to discount prices just to raise cash and avoid bankruptcy. Sign number 2. Chinese stocks have lost more than 27% of their value since the start of 2018. Fears of a slowing economy, rising debts, and the impact of US President Donald Trump's trade war have all played a role in pushing the Chinese market lower. However, a wave of forced selling of company shares could see the market drop even more. In China, hundreds of companies use their shares as collateral for loans, but when share prices fall, they are forced to sell in order to maintain a certain level of balance in brokerage accounts used to lend the company's money. 50% of Chinese millionaires are considering moving overseas because they don't trust government or the bubble. Pollution levels are getting intolerable, and they want to get their kids an English-speaking education. Sign number 4. Super wealthy investors who paid $5.5 billion for the center, in the world's most expensive real estate transaction ever, have mostly been spinning their wheels over the last 6 months, trying to sell it off floor by floor. That tells me the smart money is leaving before the bubble bursts. Sign number 5. A number of major developers have gone bankrupt. These developers are highly leveraged and pose the greatest threat to the banking system, which has grown more through shadow banking and subprime lending in the last few years than anything sustainable. Bad loans are rising fast in China. The $35 trillion pile of public and private debt is an explosive threat to the global economy. In 2008, China's total debt was about 141% of its gross domestic product. By mid-2018, that number had risen to 300%. Countries that take on such a large amount of debt in such a short period typically face a hard landing. That's why everyone, academics, private banks, the International Monetary Fund, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the Bank for International Settlements, and the People's Bank of China Governor Zhou Xiaochuan is sounding the alarm. Sign number 7. Consumer leverage has risen to worrisome levels. With a consumer share of GDP of 39%, it is obvious that in the long run growth has to be led by the consumer. The problem is that after Norway, China has had a bigger increase in household debt to GDP than any other country. A further escalation of the trade war between Washington and Beijing to include sanctions on financial products or transactions could trigger a financial crisis in China, researchers warned in a report. The study, released by Renmin University's National Academy of Development and Strategy, looked at a series of possible additional retaliatory steps the US could take in the trade war to constrain or even try to directly destroy China's financial markets, financial assets, and its currency. China's growing unemployment crisis. The growing downward pressure on China's domestic economy has made the employment situation particularly grim. Judging from the recent developments, the risk of unemployment in China is increasing, and the unemployment rate is approaching a dangerous level. Sign number 10. The Chinese economy is slowing faster than expected. The worst is yet to come, analysts say. The economy slows to its lowest growth rate in 28 years in 2018, with gross domestic product expanding 6.6%, down 0.2 percentage points from the previous year. And that's according to data by the country's National Bureau of Statistics. The last time economic growth was so tepid was 1990, when the economy slumped in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square incident. If you think 2018 has been challenging for China's economy, this year may be worse. It is crystal clear that China are in much worse condition than they were just prior to the last economic crisis, and now things are setting up for the next great economic crisis. Unfortunately, most Chinese are totally clueless about what is going on, and the vast majority are completely and totally unprepared for what is coming. I expect major problems in China likely by the summer or fall. When China blows, there won't be an effective stimulus policy from the US, Europe, or Japan to counter such a shock. It will make the US subprime crisis look like a Sunday afternoon picnic.